The Arctic Council, as many of you know, was formed really to focus on two things that were very much in common among the 8 Arctic nations, and that was protecting the environment and sustainable development. And ever since the beginning, those have been the two principal platforms, so to speak, of activity. But it is really true that for the 8 Arctic nations, the 12 countries that are observers, and the other organizations that are also observers, the good news is we have found much in common and much work that could be done that would be of benefit to all of the Arctic nations. I think one of the things that may not be as well understood is, unlike many intergovernmental organizations at the international level, there is a seat at the table for the indigenous people of the region. And as it is termed, permanent participants, that voice has been a very important part of making certain that the work of the Arctic Council is relevant to the people who live there. This is a very busy slide, so I won't spend a lot of time with it, but I do want to point out that even though we talk a lot about the Arctic Ministerial, which is about to happen in Fairbanks, the real work of the Arctic Council is primarily done by the working groups. It is really the working groups that year in and year out have participation from not only the 8 Arctic nations and the observers, but also independent experts that bring to the working group projects a lot of expertise that really develops the work of the working groups into finished products. We've also had a few special task forces over the years. Currently, those task forces, scientific cooperation, Arctic marine cooperation, telecommunications, which Tina talked about earlier, are another way in which we focus for a short period of time on things that are of importance but may not be long-term commitments by the Arctic Council. I do want to point out that over the years, the Arctic Council has produced some remarkable reports that are valuable documents in terms of not only helping to understand what is happening in the Arctic, but also to focus in on what needs to be done to assure that the sustainable development in the region and the economic development in the region, as well as the environmental protection in the region, can be done in an effective way. I'll just point out one example of that. The Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which was done in 2009, is still really the Bible on what it is that the nations of the region need to do to make shipping in the Arctic as safe as possible, and what it takes in terms of not only infrastructure, but international cooperation. And that report, like all of these reports, you can find at the Arctic Council website. There have been several agreements that have been worked through the Arctic Council process, one on search and rescue and one on oil spill response. There is a third one underway right now on scientific cooperation in the Arctic. Now, remember, the Arctic Council is not a treaty-based organization, so it cannot adopt agreements itself. What it can do is work out the details, and then every country goes back to its own process within its own government to agree, and then the agreement is hatched. And that is what happened with search and rescue, that is what happened with oil spill response, and that is what is happening, even as we speak, finalizing the scientific agreement. So the United States became the chair, and what happens is there's a rotation whereby for 2 years a country chairs the Arctic Council. And before that chairmanship begins, there's a process whereby that country proposes some of the specific areas to be worked on during the chairmanship. The United States government selected 3 principal areas. One, Arctic communities, and under that was sort of a description of what is it that needs to be done to improve the economic and living conditions of the people of the Arctic. And you can see some of the things that were developed by way of projects under that theme, like renewable energy and water and sanitation. The second theme was Arctic ocean stewardship. Obviously, the Arctic Ocean is the common thing that unites all of the Arctic nations, and it is something where we all have a stake in the health of the Arctic Ocean. There were a number of things under that theme as well, everything from an assessment of Arctic Ocean acidification to search and rescue exercises. And the third theme, Arctic climate change, was really looking at both sides of that question, what's driving it, and also how communities need to adapt to it, understanding how the changes will change lives. So those were the themes, and I'm not going to go through this very busy slide, but this just gives you a taste of some of the projects that were under those themes so that you can see the diversity of things that have been really worked on and produced reports and other deliverables under the US chairmanship. As you can see, some people assume that it is only about climate change. Actually, the US chairmanship has been robust in addressing issues of concern to the people of the Arctic. And again, I would just note things like suicide, which in the Arctic is a serious problem, both a social and an emotional as well as economic problem, to search and rescue exercises. So the deliverables, which will be produced, some will be displayed at the Fairbanks Ministerial, and some are not quite yet finished, but will be continued and finished in the near future. So again, if you are interested in the specifics of any of these, which we don't have time to talk about today, but which I would encourage you to look at the Arctic Council website. And I just want to acknowledge, because my friend Ambassador Aas is here, that Norway has been the home of the Secretariat for the Arctic Council in Tromsø, Norway. And for the last couple of years, they have done a tremendous job of both bringing together the hard work that needs to be done, archiving the reports, but also helping to expand the international understanding of the Arctic Council work. So just a couple of examples of those. Safety guidelines for unmanned aircraft systems, one of the very first things produced under the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Why is this important in the Arctic in particular? Because, of course, science is expensive and challenging and even dangerous in the Arctic. So using technology to do some of the observations and the science is pretty important, but doing it by using things like unmanned aircraft systems is pretty important that it be done safely. So the Arctic Council came out with the first in the entire world guidelines on how it could be done safely and still be compatible with aircraft. Managing shipping waste. As probably many of you know, the International Maritime Organization's voluntary polar shipping rules became mandatory January of 2017. There are a number of requirements that all of the countries need to meet that want to do shipping in the Arctic, and dealing with shipping waste is an example of one of the things where we really needed to think through how we can help each other in the Arctic, help not only shippers, but also communities adjust. And you've already heard about the Task Force on Telecommunications and the assessment that is being done in the North. I do want to mention this international science agreement, which the US chaired with Russia. It has been really an important piece of dealing with both access and availability of information from the science that is produced in the Arctic. You've heard about science and research from many speakers already this morning, but finding better ways to break down some of the barriers between the countries in the Arctic and make certain that people have access to this region, which is very international in its space and in the work that needs to be done, is a science agreement that we hope will be signed in Fairbanks. A couple of other goals that the US had, basically expanding awareness of the Arctic. As you've heard from Congressman Young, there are lots of reasons to do that. There have been a number of public outreach efforts during the US chairmanship to try to achieve that goal, everything from conferences in DC to this really interesting public outreach program, basically having radio shows from all 50 states, somebody talking about why the Arctic matters to them. So I'm going to turn the mic over in just a moment because it's really important to note that between Finland and the United States, discussions about how the chairmanship would pass easily and smoothly started 3 or 4 years ago. I remember being at a meeting in Helsinki with the then ambassador, I'm not sure who does this now, but the Arctic ambassador from Finland, Hannu Hallinen. Hannu Hallinen invited us. We had a wonderful meeting with the Arctic Advisory Board that Finland had to talk through what the US agenda was going to look like and how that would fit together with passing the baton to Finland. So this partnership has been going on, and that sort of sets up what will happen in Fairbanks. But I do want to note that for many, many reasons, the consistency of messaging of the Arctic Council and what we have worked on together successfully as a region has really promoted this sense of there is more that we share and have in common than there is that separates us. My final slide, just a small advertisement for the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which I chair. This is the website, arctic.gov, where you can get information that will be useful to you not only about Arctic research in the United States, international Arctic research, but also a reference to the Arctic Council's website that I referenced earlier. It will be a doorway to many of the things that perhaps you've heard a little bit about today, but you'd like to know more about. Thank you very much.